Good morning, Liberty. It is Friday morning, March 22nd, 2019. My name is Michael Boldin, broadcasting live from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for spending a little time with me today. I really think it's amazing. So in today's episode, which I think is going to be a little bit shorter than normal, who knows? I tend to ramble from time to time. But on this episode, I want to talk briefly about the treaty clause of the United States Constitution, Article 2, about a little bit about what that's supposed to mean. And then I want to talk about how that's being applied in practice to override the Constitution on marijuana prohibition. So the United Nations, from what I've found, has, and I've heard this from my friend Robert Scott Bell, who does a health freedom show here, a natural health and some political liberty show here on YouTube every day, Monday through Friday at noon Pacific time. So I have heard him talk about how marijuana prohibition is being enforced by the United Nations. Well, it's enforced by the member states, but it's being basically implemented through this process through the United Nations. So I did some research, and while I was doing some research on CBD, which I'm going to do an episode on soon, because a lot of people are really confused about what the so-called legal status of CBD is. Everyone assumes that, oh, since you can get it online, you can have it shipped to you, that there's obviously no more prohibition, that since the Farm Bill was signed into law over the Christmas time in 2018, in December, it was signed into law and it decriminalized industrial hemp, that somehow CBD is legalized. So I was doing some research on that for some art writing and a show that I'm going to be doing on it in the near future. But I came across the DEA talking about a United Nations treaty in regards to their prohibition efforts. So before doing that, I do want to say hi to some friends out in the live chat. We are now broadcasting live through our YouTube channel and simultaneously through Periscope and through our Facebook channel. So I appreciate whatever channel you happen to be tuning in, whether it's here live or later on in the archive. We also do BitTube, BitChute, and a podcast version, iTunes, Spotify, Google, and probably somewhere else. I forget the last one. But wherever you are, I really appreciate you tuning in, whether it's live or in the archive. So let me see if I get this chat app up, and I can see that Alton Smith and Dennis Marburger, Tom Rankin, Jay Armstrong, Ruger, and Dan Reed, awesome, all out on Facebook. I appreciate you guys. I did a really interesting podcast from the Culinary Libertarian with Dan Reed on Monday. I think he releases the episode every Monday. So that was a really fun show. We talked about raw milk, cannabis, and a bunch of other stuff. The Wholesome Meat Act, the unconstitutional 1967 act from the federal government. So I hope you guys take a look for Dan's podcast when it comes out next week. And then over on YouTube, Justin Bayola, Woodsider, Ward Lawrence, Robert Sanderson, Bob Brewer, Light for Liberty says, I love liberty, or what's left of it. Certainly what's left. Tyler B. and Existence. I appreciate you guys all spending some time with me today. So let's get right into it here. And again, thank you for spending some time with me today. First, over at Wiki, let's look at the treaty clause just very briefly. This is part of Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution, or the Constitution for the United States, that empowers the President of the United States to propose and chiefly negotiate treaties or agreements between the United States and other countries, which upon receiving the advice and consent of a two-thirds supermajority, become binding with the force of federal law. Now, they don't put any caveats. They basically just says the President can come up with this agreement. The President can comes up with these proposals for agreements with other countries and then goes to the Senate. And as long as they approve it, it's got the force of law. But there's no limitations, it seems, at least in reading that. They can do whatever they want. But here's the text. The President shall have power by and with the advice of and consent of the Senate. Let me read that again. The President shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided two-thirds of the senators present concurred. So, concur, not concurred. Now, I can't pull this up on the screen for you, but my buddy Dave Benner, who's a longtime blogger and researcher and historian here for the 10th Amendment Center and independent, he publishes a lot of his work here. but he wrote a great book called Compact for America. And I was asking, I know we have some good articles from Nadelson, Meharry, and a number of other people on the treaty power over on our website. And mind you, all the links that I'm talking about, besides this next piece that I'm going to cover, they should be in the show notes, whatever platform you're watching outside of Periscope, which doesn't allow me to do that. But if you really want to go and find the show notes for this show and all of our archives, you're going to go over to 10thamendmentcenter.com/Good Morning Liberty. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/Good Morning Liberty. That's where you can get all of our archives, the show notes, the links, all that good stuff. So Dave is writing a new book. I didn't realize this. I guess he's been really keeping it under wraps. Dave's writing a new book, and he has a pretty extensive section on the treaty power and the history of it. And he asked that I don't release it. It's obviously just in draft form, but I read through it, man, and it's like 5.5 pages so far of information on the history of the treaty power. And he talks about in here how the treaty power under the Confederation, because if you're thinking about what did they do in the Constitution, you have to kind of look what their experience was previously. So under the Articles of Confederation, treaties, there was no executive branch to propose them. Now, I don't really know, and I guess I should look into it, how they were proposed. They were only approved upon agreement of 9 states. There wasn't advice and consent at the time. There wasn't the executive proposing it. Maybe, and I know there was a rotating presidency that happened at the time. I'm not sure if any particular state could propose one under the Confederation, and maybe Benner's going to get into this a little bit more detail, or I needed to read it a little bit more closely when it's not super late at night. But Dave talks about how under the Articles, there was no kind of kingly prerogative, which had been the history of treaties over the years. So as long as they had the consent of 9 states, they could enter into a treaty. And that's how they got the Treaty of Paris with Britain in 1783, which, quote, acknowledged the independence of the states separately as independent polities. So there was a lot of information here about the kind of the background, the debate at the convention. He covers James Madison, John Dickinson, different proposals, George Mason, etc., and how even during the ratification debates, some people didn't like the final version that we ended up getting, which I just read to you through Wiki there. But in the end, we know that one important thing that they agreed on was that the treaty power wasn't, how do I put it? It wasn't like its own constitution. They couldn't just say, well, we've got this constitution which says in this supremacy clause that the federal government can do things and they're supreme in the things that they do, provided that they're done in pursuance of the delegated powers of the Constitution. Then we're going to give them this extra power in there that renders everything null and void in it, because they can just make a treaty with anybody. And if you understand the power of empire, it would be very easy then to have a treaty with any single country, which really exists as a vassal state, that says, well, you don't have the right to keep and bear arms. Free speech can only be done with a permission slip, whatever it may be, and then therefore you can override the rest of the Constitution. Dave basically puts it this way: the treaty-making power doesn't allow the Senate and the President to construct and implement treaties to displace or cede political power outside of their defined constitutional limits or bounds, or alter the structure of the government itself. So as long as it's in pursuance of the delegated powers of the Constitution, then they can do that treaty. There's not any limitations. In fact, they actually struck at the Philadelphia Convention, they actually struck any limitations on the types of treaties. They didn't say, like, you can't do it on land, you can't do it on international trade. They said, as long as it doesn't violate the powers delegated to the federal government and the Constitution, you can come into agreements with these other countries. So he gave an example. For example, if they were going to give a foreign government the power to enact naturalization law, for example, or to tax Americans through a treaty, that would be considered unconstitutional. So the next piece that I want to cover here that goes a little bit further, and I'm sorry to not be able to have that on screen for people who are watching, but I'm very grateful for Dave Benner. And if you haven't gotten his first book, Compact to the Republic, it is extremely good. He also does a podcast. He's done a bunch of videos and stuff. So please look for Dave Benner and follow his work as well. But I'm very grateful for him sharing that with me to be able to share a little bit of a preview of his new book with you today. So here's what Mike Meharry had to write about this. This was back in August of last year. The article, Treaties Do Not Trump the Constitution. Now, this isn't a play on words in regards to the current president, but a lot of people have told us over the years that the ones who love centralized power, or who just love centralized power when their team is doing it, and that can be Republicans or Democrats. We always hear that, federal power always trumps state power. States can't do anything about the federal government whenever they want to do something. If the feds say no, they can't do it. Now, if you listen to my Supremacy Clause episode back in February, you know that the federal government is supreme only when they're exercising powers delegated to them in the Constitution, not just on anything and everything that they might want to do. The same concept goes with treaties, and I apologize for those of you hearing a little bit of construction in the background. Hopefully that won't be too bad today. So treaties also do not trump the Constitution. The Constitution itself is the supreme law of the land, so an extra constitutional agreement, an agreement with another country that overrides the Constitution in and of itself is null and void. Mike cites constitutional scholar Rob Nadelson here, who says the treaty has the force only of a statute, not a super constitution. It isn't another constitution that is over the top of the current one. And Mike goes on, he says, quote, nothing stands above the Constitution. That includes treaties. Nothing stands above the Constitution. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Per the Supremacy Clause, any treaty entered into by the U.S. must be, quote, in pursuance of the Constitution, just like any law passed by Congress. And Mike goes on, he says, a treaty not in pursuance of the Constitution is null, void, and of no effect. So that is, I think, pretty straightforward because it's under the Supremacy Clause itself. It just says that in pursuance thereof. Justin Bayola says, so it would seem all treaties require which they have done many times over. They just go around limitations of power or delegate authority to others. Yeah, and this is the same thing. It's called the non-delegation doctrine. They can't basically delegate a power that's been delegated to Congress to the president. That's basically what Congress has done with the power to declare war. They say the executive branch can do this. So they're doing the same thing on the treaty power. They're saying, well, okay, well, we have these limitations, but, now let's do whatever we want under the treaty power. Aviator Tom points this out over on YouTube as well. According to Article 6, Section 2 of the Constitution, not only shall all laws be made in pursuance of the Constitution or be rendered in null and void, but also treaties. It does mention treaties in the Supremacy Clause as well. So Mike gets into the same example that I mentioned. So, for instance, he writes, a treaty that violates the people's right to keep and bear arms would not be valid under the U.S. Constitution, period. If the treaty violates the people's right to keep and bear arms, it is not valid. Any limitation on the federal government is a limitation on the federal government. They didn't just say, oh, okay, we're going to limit your power, but if you decide to get into a deal with France, no, those limitations don't count. I mean, I don't think anyone can point me to a founding father who said, these restrictions on federal power, these delegated powers mean nothing. The 10th Amendment reserves all powers to the states or the people or to treaties. It doesn't say that. So people are making this up when they talk about it. And in this blog post from last year, Mike includes a quote from George Washington on May 8th, 1796. He says, we are an independent nation and act for ourselves. But if we are to be told by a foreign power what we shall do and what we shall not do, we have independence yet to seek and have contended hitherto for very little. So Washington was saying, if the foreign countries are telling us what to do, we aren't free. And now he wasn't necessarily talking about specifically, I think, the treaty power. Maybe he was in this letter. Let me click through, see if I can find it here for those of you watching. This is a letter from Washington to Hamilton. I don't know. I'm not sure if he's specifically talking about the treaty power here, but he certainly is talking about the ability to be independent. And if you're saying that we're going to make an agreement where the other countries around the world are telling us how to act, then that isn't independence. You aren't an independent nation anymore. Now, there's also some quotes in this blog, and again, all the links are in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/goodmorningliberty. He included some quotes from the ratification debates. So around the states. Now, the Constitution, a lot of people like to look to the founders, the Federalist Papers, the conversations at the Philadelphia Convention. But whatever their intention may have been, whatever the Federalists may say, the legal meaning of the Constitution is what the people of the several states, the people who gave it legal force in the ratification convention. So you can find a lot of really good information there as well. Here's one specifically about the treaty power. No treaty shall be effectual to repeal or abrogate the constitutions or Bill of Rights of the states or any part of them. None. No treaty can do this, can change either the states or the federal government's constitution. Here's another one. No treaty is to be construed so to operate as to alter the constitution of any state. No treaty. None. Not like once in a while, or if it's on guns or on cannabis. That doesn't count. So let's take a look at, I also included a link called What Does It Mean for the Senate to Give Its Advice and Consent? I'm not going to cover that here, but if you want to read a little bit more about that, there's some interesting information in that one. That is also included in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/goodmorningliberty. So let's take a look at the next one. I'm doing some research here, and I'm looking in the Federal Register. And if you follow me on Twitter, I was talking about how, man, I never thought I would be a person who's reading the Federal Register. And it's insane to read this stuff because they publish something, and then you as a citizen, you get a chance to comment on it, and then they read it, and then they do what they want anyways. So this is a final order from the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, on September 28, 2018, regarding CBD. Now, again, I'm going to do a full show. I've got an article coming out covering CBD and the legal status under federal law on that in the near future. So I'm not going to get into too much detail on that right now. But one part that I saw on this is that they were talking about, their power to do this. And in the Federal Register, if they're going to do something, they're having to cite, and maybe there's some kind of regulation that tells them they have to do this, but they're basically citing the background and their own legal authority, according to in their own words, where they get the legal authority to do what they're claiming to do. And here it says, the United States is a party to the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, 1961, also called the Single Convention, and other international conventions designed to establish effective control over international and domestic traffic in controlled substances. So again, that's the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. And again, I've heard of this, but I'd never really read through it. So I included a link to that in the show notes. So if you want to read the full text of this was a treaty from 1961. It looks like it went into effect in the United States on June 24th, 1967. After the Senate gave its advice and consent to the United States accession. So you can read that if you want to get all the details. But basically, the Drug Enforcement Agency, which shouldn't exist, is telling us that they're enforcing drug prohibition on marijuana products, cannabis products, based on a United Nations treaty, agreement with the United Nations. It says specifically, the enactment and enforcement of the Controlled Substances Act are the primary means by which the United States carries out its obligations under the Single Convention. So we know that the 1970 Controlled Substances Act is banning all supposed controlled substances, including marijuana. So when people talk about cannabis, they want it to be descheduled. It's under that Controlled Substances Act. But it isn't just something that came about through Congress. They didn't just come up with this idea. They were doing it to implement a United Nations treaty from 1961. So again, if we're connecting the dots and we're finding out where the source of the problem is here, I would think that it's the idea of using a treaty to do something that under alcohol prohibition required a constitutional amendment. So they previously required a constitutional amendment to ban a product, to ban something that people consumed, alcohol, in order to do that. But then the people wised up and looked at all the problems from prohibition, and they decided to repeal it. So maybe it went through, those control freaks' heads like, oh man, well, we can't leave it up to the people of the states because then they're going to change their mind and we're not going to be able to keep this in effect. Let's just do a treaty. We'll do an end run around that limitation and we'll implement it anyways. And that's what it looks like they did in 1961. And people have basically turned a blind eye to it for a long time. Now, we still see a lot of cannabis legalization around the United States, all over the place. Here in California, it started in many ways back in 1996. Now, the single convention only bans non-medical, so there wasn't a really big concern with supposedly medical marijuana. Maybe there had been issued some statements over the years, but I'm not sure. I haven't done that deep of research. But a bigger deal is full legalization, and the first nation that I'm aware of, Portugal, I think, decriminalized. But Canada this last year legalized. And here's what they had to say. Here's what the United States, they put out. What's the name of this organization? It's the International Narcotics Control Board. I don't know if this is something from the UN. I'll look here in a moment. But here's what they said in a press release last year on October 17th. The legalization by Canada of cannabis for non-medical purposes is incompatible with the legal obligations incumbent upon states parties under the International Drug Control Framework and is a violation of fundamental provisions of the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotics Drugs as amended by the 1972 Protocol. So here we have an international kind of control group. I don't know what type of enforcement mechanism they use. I don't know, but there's a group that is there monitoring nations to make sure that they don't violate this treaty of 1961, which was amended in 1972 last. Let's take a look. What does it say about? Who are these people? The International Narcotics Control Board is an independent and quasi-judicial expert body established by the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961 by merging two bodies, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's really interesting. I guess for me, this is a great reason to not really, I think it's good to have communication, commerce, and peace. But when Thomas Jefferson was president, he reduced the size of the government so much that there were only embassies in 3 countries by the end of his 2 terms. So I don't know if all this kind of garbage is really needed. I would say absolutely not, because really it's leading to them doing end runs around the restrictions of the power of the federal government. And we know, like with the arms treaty and all kinds of things, they want to really ramp it up. So looking back over in the live chat, let's see what's going on here. Taking a look here. The NAFTA has a lot of violations of the Constitution, says Ward Lawrence over on YouTube. Tyler says, the type of people that make excuses for more power exercised by the feds are the same people who failed history, or they succeeded history, because the history they teach us is the people who are running the schools are really a big part of the problem. So I hope you guys found this interesting. I apologize for the construction that's been going on in the background. I might actually move the show to an earlier time next week because they seem to start at around 9 a.m. my time. So maybe I'll start doing it at 8:30 a.m., but I will make sure to post an update. So I hope you found this interesting, educational. I think it's pretty irritating that they're doing this kind of thing. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Please make sure to smash the like button, whatever platform you're watching on. And I'll see you next week, Monday and Wednesday only. There will be no Friday show next week. Have a great weekend, and thank you so much for spending some time with me today.